Hi, my name is Samuel Loncar. I'm a philosopher, and I'm the host of this YouTube channel that is an experiment kind of in a new phase of online education. I've been giving a lecture series on Martin Heidegger, and this is the last installment, you could say, in that series that's going to be publicly available. Because what I want to do in this very brief lecture is explain what I see myself as having done in the previous lectures, connect that to what I argued in my first lecture about where we're at in the role of technology in the transformation of education. I think we're really at the end, a complete end of a civilizational era, and how we think about education has not at all adapted in spite of all of the claims to do so, in spite of all of the claims to have true online education. I think there's no real vision in our society for how to actually maintain an educated society in a world in which nothing is the same and nothing stays the same. So that is, to me, a fundamental technical problem we have in our society. For example, software gets better and yet stuff doesn't work as well and it gets harder to use. What does that mean? Technology progresses, but stuff is still backwards in many ways, like our infrastructure, as people always talk about in Silicon Valley. We have all of these narratives in our society about where we're at, but the truth is COVID has simply revealed what everyone who has been an intelligent critic of the modern Western society for hundreds of years has always known and said, with incisive arguments that are simply and easily ignored by people in power, which is this: the modern world is in a fundamental way a farce. It conceives of itself as an essentially superior form of civilization, which was in fact run by racist, ethnocentric, disgusting white men who used every sacred value of their society, including their religion, as an excuse for all of the oldest, most common, and disgusting forms of evil. And to this day, many of those people still run our society and actively fight every movement, whatever it's called, Me Too, woke. They fight any movement that seeks to draw any accountability to the true history of our society. The fact that Western society has those problems, to me, is no argument against its merits. It's simply an argument against people who are stupid and unethical enough to deny those problems. But that's most of the people who control our society. And higher education has tried to pretend that it cares about issues of equity and access, but the truth is simply this: the best people in higher education as teachers are not hired at the best schools. The best researchers are not anymore at the best research universities. And the actual nature and flow of talent in higher education has almost nothing now to do with the institutional structures that we recognize as institutions of higher education. And this is the same in every industry that's related to literacy. Publishing is like this. Publishers do not know, as they never have. We always try to know, but you don't know in advance really whether a book is going to sell. You have to take risks, but those risks are educated if you have industry expertise. And if you talk to honest publishers and honest editors today, no one really knows what's going to sell. And the numbers reflect the crisis, and COVID has only worsened that. So the truth is, what I've been arguing in the course of this series on Heidegger has been fundamentally, as you've seen if you've been following this, an argument about the structure of Western philosophy, religion, and the self-characterization of modernity. Modernity characterizes itself as a pinnacle of history when it is in fact a laughable exception to even the most basic norms of decency that would characterize societies anthropologists would have until recently called primitive. We are a society that uses names like mental health and police to justify the fact that families will have other family members taken away, like in a totalitarian fictional novel or something that we project onto foreign countries we don't like Russia or China. We simply call it mental health. And this isn't because there's nothing real. We have huge mental health crises, but one of them is the mental health profession, as anyone who follows that profession knows. And ever since the DSM crisis in psychiatry in the 1970s, which anyone educated in this subject will know, people in the psychiatric profession themselves have been perfectly well aware of the fundamentally artificial and constructed nature of their knowledge, something that is now 60 years old since even Foucault was writing about it. So the truth is, the forces that govern our society, like the police, which have been under such critique and which are a very important institution, but also an extremely dangerous one when corrupted, and like most institutions are often corrupted. The police, mental health, the medical industry, these are industries and societies need them, but we know that the societies we haven't been honest about the role of these industries. Not because science isn't real, quite the opposite. As those of you who know my work know, one of my biggest concerns is the threat to the credibility of science in our culture. I think science is the only thing that can help all of us regardless of our beliefs and backgrounds, come together around a shared premise, which is when you ask a question and want to know the answer, we're all in agreement you're looking for the truth. When you ask a question and want to know the answer, we can all be in agreement you're looking for the truth. That is the premise of science. It seems so minor. It is not. It is not minor. To actually care to ask a question, to care to admit that you're ignorant by asking it, and to care to find out the truth is exactly to care about the space between what we are right now and the space between what we could become if we bothered giving a damn. And that is the root of science. It is the root of everything beautiful in human life. The artist's sort of incessant sense of imperfection, that everything they do that people outside cannot understand, the artist always feels like everything they do is never enough. It is never enough, and they're right. Because for them, what it means to be an artist is to be a person who is driven by an ideal of perfection that you can only experience through your intensely acute perception of your own imperfection. This is why artists are so neurotic, and some philosophers too. You know, there's a if you like Larry David, there's a Larry David in every philosopher, because a philosopher, by my understanding, is a human being who's woken up to the fact that they're not human yet. So I think that the arguments I've been making about modernity and Heidegger are of value to the public, and I'm grateful so much for those of you who've been listening. And I am happy to have been able to offer them for free. I'm going to continue this course treating the online material now as the kind of first section of a course, an introduction available literally to anyone who wants to watch it ever. And then I'll provide to those who are already in my educational network, I'll provide access to information about how you could continue to study and watch videos with me or study directly with me in certain contexts, seminars in different places in the world that will pop up. And those of you who are already aware of those are aware of them, and those of you who want to be can learn how to be. So if you're interested in any of that, of course, I welcome you to pursue that. I have no interest in sort of making money through this. Of course, I charge and I take what I do very seriously. I'm just saying I'm not marketing this, so I'm not giving you any information about where to find it or anything like that. I believe that the people who want things look for them, and that the people who look for things are the people who are really worth learning with. So it's been a pleasure to do this series so far, and I'm going to be releasing more videos on other series, so please don't worry. I'll be doing a lot more free and online philosophy talks and lectures. But I wanted in this brief lecture to bring what I've done in the past videos to a place of immediate cultural relevance. And that's what I've been trying to do in the past few minutes, and I want to make that a little explicit now in relationship to the previous material. Because you could say, I don't get the connection. Well, let's just go back to the first lecture. I said that the Weimar Era was an era that in many ways is like ours. Here's my real argument. We've never gotten out of the Weimar Era. So if you haven't listened to it, please go back and listen to my first lecture. And that's worth re-listening to, I think, just to get a sense of what I'm concerned with, because the urgency and the sense of cultural intensity that I believe I was able to convey in that lecture about my own love for that period is rooted in the fact that I have never seen that period as anything but the condition and key to understanding our own moment. The Weimar Era, and it was a German Jewish phenomenon. Of course, there were other countries involved, but this was a deeply German Jewish phenomenon. Just for that reason, the Holocaust was more than just a sort of massive human rights tragedy. It was the internal destruction of what had built many of the greatest things about the society that it destroyed. And it was partly this incredible confluence of just unbelievable education resources that had been created through the German university system and inheriting the medieval university system, and the cultural confluence of many empires meeting together, and global capitalism and a new form of international cosmopolitanism like we hadn't seen since sort of the Renaissance at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. So everyone believed that the era leading up to the Weimar Era was the beginning of the true prosperity of the world, which then was immediately destroyed in the trenches of World War I, in which died not only the youth of Europe, but its dreams, its hopes, and its last sense of an identity that it was wanting to believe in. And that crisis, that slow-burning crisis of World War I that killed neo-Kantian philosophy and academia, that killed all the traditional forms of cultural Protestantism in religion as being any respectable future, and therefore it killed off a great number of also good things. But it was in a fundamentally legitimate way the destruction of bourgeois values. And by bourgeois values, I'm not speaking as some snide and contemptuous Marxist about what is, I do not at all dispute, one of the greatest things about our society, the idea of privacy, the idea that families can assemble in a traditional way if they wish to, or in a way that incorporates all of their concerns for culture and large houses. This is all very relatively historically novel. And the culture of privacy, the culture of domesticity is an essential part, as historians have known and argued, like Peter Gay, of the culture of capitalism and the culture of interiority, which is linked directly to the culture of consumption in the West. So I'm not trying to say anything simplistic about this, but the simple fact is that the culture we live in, we all know no longer has any sense of identity. And the reason that we're open for the first time en masse as a society to listening to the truth of people who represent social justice concerns, not only about the present, but how those present concerns are directly caused by unacknowledged and undealt with past problems. Those people are being listened to now because for the first time we know we don't have any other choice. And so I'm not here to take a particular position on highly complicated and often just quite frankly local, like to the US. I'm talking to any of you listening, and I know many of you are in all the parts of the world. So I want to keep this as concrete but general as possible. I don't want to take any positions on those cultural debates other than those you already have seen me to apparently be taking if you've seen that. But what I want to point out is those debates are exactly why we need a form of life that acknowledges public philosophy, which is just a way of saying practicing being human to other people so that they can hold you accountable. So that you can't say, well, I went to Yale, and if you want to challenge me, why don't you get into Yale? Which is, like, frankly, the attitude of a lot of people at Yale, because they're afraid of being challenged because they don't know fuck all about the stuff they claim to. I'm not saying all of them, but everyone knows who interacts with people who are prestigious. There's a deep insecurity, rightly, because the average European scholar knows, at least 3 or 4 more languages than the average American scholar. And American scholars know that, and it's embarrassing, and they should be embarrassed. So I'm not an advocate of elite education. I think elite education is great. Societies that have it, of course, have it for a reason, and it confers a value, or societies wouldn't value it. And I'm glad that I was able to do that. My undergrad was not elite, and I came from a very middle class background. So my experience of the Ivy League was a real destruction of what I had imagined the American upper class to be, and an introduction into the true nature of power. Not the true nature of education. I had to teach myself that on my own with Plato and Kierkegaard and so many others, and particularly more recently Baldwin and some of the great writers of the 20th century. So that's where I learned education, but I was able to study and I was able to practice my craft as a scholar through the great resources I had at Yale, for which I am very grateful. But those resources have never been available to everyone. Even when they were more available than they are now, they've never been as available as they should be. And I, as a simple alumni, can't do anything about that. But what I can do is I can show any of us who are interested what we all know as the people who are interested in videos like this, which is that you don't need a $10 billion endowment and a set of excuses to have a reason to exclude the rest of the world from a quality education. You just need to be honest that you don't want them to have it. That's all. Harvard and Yale and Princeton and these other schools, they, as many people have pointed out, put a number of their courses online for free. So in that sense, you could say they're providing a free education, which is great. I love that they do that. One of my professors, Bruce Gordon, has a great free course you can watch on church history at Yale. And it's terrific. So it's a great thing Yale and Harvard and others have done. But here's the simple fact. They're never going to give, as anyone who studies this points out, they're never going to give those people Harvard and Yale degrees. Because Harvard and Yale degrees are exactly valuable because you can't have them, right? It's like an expensive high fashion. It's valuable to people who are shallow because they have to tell people, or they have to wear a name that says Valentino or whatever you like on it. And then because of that, they can feel valuable because they have something that other people don't have. That's what name brand education is too, and we all know it, especially Europeans, who I think are often quite a little bit perplexed by the Ivy League system, but they're respectful because at a distance, they know there's so many great scholars there, which there are. There's no question of that. You can buy talent, and insofar as you can, the Ivy League show what it can do, and they now show its limitations. You can't actually buy talent in the long term. You have to recognize it. And to recognize it, you have to have it. And when you're not honest about the talent you have, and you're not honest about why you retain the people you do, you in time will lose access to good judgment about talent. And whether you think that's happened or not, the matter is evident to those interested. So we're at a point in education in which we have to confront whether we really want to learn or whether we want to be credentialed. And we just need to stop pretending that those aren't two completely independent conversations. I would say if you want to be credentialed, I or friends I have done a ton of work with people getting into these type of schools. I know how to do that. I just think if someone wants that, they should pursue that. That is not the same thing as wanting to be educated. If you want to be educated, you literally have the resources, like the hype in Silicon Valley says, and is true. They don't know why it's true for the reasons they think it's not true, but they are right. The resources we now have, just through something like YouTube, are stunning. They are unbelievable. And I use them with my students. I've been teaching in a very, you could say, creative way for years outside of the university. I was doing my Ph.D. at Yale, but I'd already been running a philosophical school for, 7, 8 years now. And I've had people who are, work in banking, people who are PhDs themselves, people in all kinds of industries. People who work at hotels. All kinds of class and industries. I've always been doing this, but this is the first time I'm doing it publicly, you could say. And that's what I've been doing with this course, is I wanted to provide an introduction that wasn't about me, that is about Heidegger, and then through Heidegger, about Heidegger's significance, which is that Heidegger was the thinker who admitted and knew that we were in crisis and that it was over. It was over. And Heidegger's great late essay, Das Ende der Philosophie und die Ausgabe des Denkens, which many of you know is the end of philosophy and the task of thinking, is I believe the English translation. Heidegger gives a very classical neo-Kantian narrative, which I've been actually implicitly giving and recuperating just in these past 15 minutes, but that I gave in more detail in some of the earlier lectures, which is the idea that philosophy has come to an end of itself. It's succeeded so much it got parceled out into specialized sciences. Psychology used to be part of philosophy, physics used to be part of philosophy, now they're independent sciences. This is the very intelligent story that neo-Kantians and sociologists were telling in Heidegger's youth, and that he was telling when he was an old man in this very interesting essay. So that's basically true if you want to think of academic philosophy that way. But here's the reality. If you study the history of academic philosophy, that narrative implies something rather different than what it suggests, which is this. As soon as academic philosophy came into existence, philosophy went out of existence. And I think there's something extremely compelling about that. The German university essentially has you could say, eine geistige Krise, an intellectual, mental, spiritual crisis that really is, I would say, a similar crisis to what composers have, you could say, particularly in the 19th and 20th century, who wrote symphonies after Beethoven. Now, you could say this is really a stretch, but I think if you've been here for the Heidegger, you won't mind the Beethoven analogy. So let me just explain. Those of you who love music, I'm not a professional musician, I just like music, and Beethoven was my favorite when I was a young kid and still is now. I remember reading a story about Schubert. And when Schubert was writing, he had, I think, famously lamented to a friend, how can you write a symphony after Beethoven? And that anxiety, particularly at going past 9, that you see in Schubert all the way to Mahler, that anxiety is rooted in love. It is rooted in the greatness that a great musician, a great kind of, in a way, unparalleled musician, a kind of, a Keats/Beethoven of music like Schubert, if it's at Schumann and Schubert. It's incredible to see that Schubert's sort of intimidation in that highest sense, recognition of the colossalness, the kind of impenetrable colossalness, and yet completely, eternally light and airy achievement of what the Beethoven symphonies are, this complete domination of sense and sound. It's hard to think about that and then say, I'm going to now do one of those. If you're pious about music, the way that a great composer, of course, or any musician is, if you're pious about music, you really think about the people you love and you think, boy, I'd love to do that, but how do you really do that? And Beethoven is that, you could say, at the highest level. It's how do you write a symphony after Beethoven? Well, I think German philosophy really had a how do you do philosophy after Kant and Hegel and the German idealists. And they're right to have done that because those thinkers systematized their position. They argued everything they were doing was the highest form of science, more scientific than anything, including the natural sciences. There's a very consistent theme in the German idealist philosophy of science from Kant and Schelling, Hegel, Fichte. They all think that their own science of philosophy, but particularly the idealists after Kant, they really argue very rigorously that what they're doing is not only scientific, it's the most scientific thing there is. So this is about the science of philosophy, which is why it had that, what might have seemed misleading, lecture title until now. So the science of philosophy is the idea that philosophy not only belongs in the university as a distinct discipline, but it embodies the legitimacy of the university, which at the time of Humboldt, at the time of Schleiermacher, at the time of Schubert, Beethoven, Hegel, that was true. Philosophy did embody the legitimacy of the university, and we're still reading it. If you're a serious person and you want to understand the world, you can't understand the world without knowing something about Marx. Well, Marx is a Hegelian. So now you have to understand something about a guy who, when he died, said no one understood me except for one guy, and even he didn't. At least that's a famous anecdote. So Hegel, like I've mentioned many times with many figures, Hegel is just one example, like Kant, who looms over the last 200 years of science and physics in a way that is rarely acknowledged. The depth of modern physics and science to Immanuel Kant is not, I think, adequately acknowledged. So the German idealists truly are scientific revolutionaries. And the core of their scientific revolution was the scientific argument that academic philosophy was a science. And the unfortunate fact is that they were wrong. And everyone knew it, including them, about all of the other person's arguments. Whether or not there is, as the end of the Phenomenologie beautifully culminates in, das absolute Wissen, whether there really is that, it's not in the university, and it's certainly not something that Hegel could have proven to a tenure committee. Thank God he didn't have to. So the university now, in its so-called crisis, is simply the effect of the fate of philosophy's unacknowledged self-destruction. Philosophy, at its peak, made an essential claim which justified its place at the place it claimed it should be, the pinnacle of the university. No longer the handmaiden of the sciences, philosophia as a term had now sort of retained its original sort of monotheistic supremacy in the university. And so the philosophers, having triumphed over the theologians who had subordinated them in the beginning in the Middle Ages to the queen of the sciences, philosophy understood itself in the broadest sense to be the true pinnacle of the university. And so it was. And so it was. And the philosophers were amazing. And we all know the history of the 19th century university basically produced everything we value today, institutionally, intellectually. It is one of the most extraordinary achievements of the human species as we have been able to record it. And it was in crisis by the beginning of the 20th century. So it didn't even last 100 safe years. Nietzsche in the 70s was saying he was writing the history of the next 200 years. And he was so critical, even in the 50s and 60s, of the university system as he had found it as a philologist, a brilliant young philologist in Switzerland. So the university has always been in crisis. Isn't that curious? Isn't that curious that the university has always been in crisis? It's always been in crisis because the pinnacle of the university was the greatest self-understanding of it, which is the people who said they understood reason as if reason understood itself through them. And those are the beautiful rationalists of the German idealists. It is the way in which German idealism, in all of its unbelievable synthetic power to absorb so much of the corporeal and the religious, is a masterpiece of the sort of articulacy and power of rationalism in the deepest sense, a commitment to the reality and transcendent power, presence of reason as a divine agent that enables us to illumine ourselves and the world around us in a pattern, structured, and ever more articulate way. This is a beautiful vision. It is the vision on which the Western Modern Research University was premised, and the vision has failed, and not because I claim anything about whether it is true, but because I claim that the facts are self-evident. Who now will ever, unironically, since even the 1830s or 40s, assert simply Hegel's claims about the own scientific status of his philosophy? It is as laughable to do that as it would be to say that about Freud, as Freud thought about himself, that he thought he was just a rigorous scientist. This is nonsense. But every great movement since the German idealists has characterized itself as scientific, including, of course, Marxism, including, of course, many things today that claim to be scientific. So science and reason are the only real gods that the modern world officially has. And that God is embodied in the university. Well, the education system is not in crisis. The education system is defined by the name crisis ever since we've been talking about this for the last at least 200 years. Because that system has always been a hope that was projected onto the past and present as a reality. And the hope has died and the reality is now manifesting through stink. If scholars really believed in truth above profit, why do they whore themselves out in stupid grant projects that they know no one's interested in and that they themselves won't read, that they only do because they want to be wined and dined, which is completely legitimate, but you could get a job that just lets you do that without having to pretend it's what you're interested in doing to have dinner. And there's nothing wrong with these foundations, and there's nothing wrong with grants in science. We need more grants, but we need them to be intelligently allocated. And we need to understand that if grants are driving research, research isn't research. And you can say, how do you know that? Well, just look at all the history of what we would consider significant research and ask whether it was created through these structures. The answer is self-evident, it's no. And then ask, since we've had these structures, what has been the sort of pinnacle of achievement, and is incomparable to, say, physics in the first 50 years of the 20th century when there was no peer review. Also, self-evident answer. So people can just do what they like, but that is self-evident. If you know any of the information on the subject matter, it is self-evident. Physicists have been talking about a crisis, all kinds of different physicists for at least 50 years. So if you're aware of this, you will find the crisis language is present everywhere, and it goes way farther back than people recognize. Why is it in crisis? For the reason that I'm doing this course publicly. Those of you who know Heidegger know that one of his most important texts, and no one likes to acknowledge his philosophical relevance, is the rector's address he gave as a Nazi for the Nazi University of Freiburg, his famous Instructor Bio. And I'm not going to discuss that in detail now, but I will in the seminar. That will be the continuation of this course for those who are interested in being part of that and accessing that material when it becomes available on video, at least. Or some of you will be in it live, of course. But I will discuss the Rectorat's Rede in detail at the end of the course, at the end of the Heidegger course that I started with these free lectures. But here's what I want to mention now. The Rectorat's Rede was the most philosophically significant address by a university president in the 20th century, and I dare anyone to confute me, and I say, what is the alternative? Who, as a speaker, who was a rector of a university in the 20th century, had an intellectual stature independent of that position comparable to Martin Heidegger's, as it was perceived by himself, by his contemporaries, and by the world even now, 70 years later? Who? I don't think there is anyone. Okay, how many philosophers have been rectors of a university in the middle of what is to them a world historical millennial transition to the purity of their Aryan race? As far as I know, none. So Heidegger's position as the rector of the university is, in a way, you could say, the first chance, in a very way that I would hate, but Karl Popper would probably love. It's a kind of confirmation of his ridiculous idea of the history of philosophy. But, a kind of like Platonic triumph. I don't, of course, believe that, in the sense of here we have a philosopher king. The great philosopher of Germany has the opportunity to lead the great German people into a great new vision of their German essence. And he uses his address as the rector of the University of Freiburg for the Nazi Party in the early 1930s to do what? To explicitly show that he has renounced all commitment to ratio, to Vernunft, to logos, to the idea, to the eidos, to form. And he has instead committed himself, just like he does in Sein und Zeit in the 27 at the end, his language of Schicksal, fate, and all these heavy, profound, moving Teutonic words of no clear meaning, and yet an inexorable existential urgency. He uses his task as the rector of the university to be a philosopher who hoard his intellect and the depth of his very vocabulary and concepts for the German shit Adolf Hitler. And that was the only proper interpretation of the career of Martin Heidegger's culmination, or the culmination of his career. Because as Heidegger understood his career, Nazism was its culmination. That's exactly what he says if you read the material from the time or just read the Rectorat's Rede. Heidegger, as every great egotist, saw his world historical circumstances not as an ethical problem, but rather, of course, as the confirmation of the importance of his own philosophy, and his recognition as a rector a confirmation of his own importance, that he would help shepherd, if only Hitler were enlightened enough, he would help shepherd the German people into their distinctive German essence, purified of the wayward, globe-trotting Jews and their cosmopolitanism. We need a rooted German essence This was not a betrayal of Heidegger's philosophy. It was not a blip, and it is not intellectually insignificant. It is the highest position Heidegger ever held in the university, especially given his then ignominious shadow role after World War II. And it is the one most systematically ignored in mainstream just presentations in the Academy of Heidegger's value because it is so obviously indefensible, but no one even bothers arguing what is it that is indefensible. Heidegger said as a rector of the university what every university president to this day has not said but meant. Heidegger did not say he believed in reason and truth. He did not say he believed that the university was for universal human values. He did not say that the German university's greatness was that it served all of science, that it served French people and Chinese people and Brazilian people and people of any color and any race and any sexual identity. Heidegger wouldn't have said that. He didn't say that, and he could have said all kinds of versions of that. He absolutely did not. He said what he had trained himself to say. He said what he had taught himself to think, and he accurately represented, who could deny that he did? He accurately represented what he felt to be the existential culmination of his career. And it is a piece of serious philosophy that is gross. I teach it because it's serious. I don't teach it publicly because it's gross. And you have to get through the material that I teach to be able to interpret it in an ethically competent and intellectually honest way, because there is interesting material in it, and there's no doubt of that. There is no doubt of that. So that's the university according to Heidegger. It is a place for the particular interests of the particular people in power at that particular time. Well, I ask you, not whether or not university presidents are Nazis, which is an absurd idea, but whether the system that we have come to look on so horribly, that many people did not look on horribly at the time, Nazism, whether or not we ourselves do not as humans always operate some system like that, that we simply clothe in a name that enough people around us agree to call good. Because that is the real claim made by people in social justice, and that is why many people are threatened, and they are right to be threatened. They are right to be threatened because the threat is this. You have told us why we are suffering, and you have told us a lie, and we both know it, and now we're telling you we know. As I said in the first season of Becoming Human, I never advise people come to me or my understanding of philosophy for safety. I think philosophy will destroy your life. I think it'll give it back to you, but the one you get back will not be the one you've ever had. It'll be a return to something new for the first time, and I don't have an insurance policy for that. But the truth is, if you want to know where we are, study Heidegger. Study anyone, whether it's me or other people, me and other people, or not me and other people. Who you know cares more about getting something right than getting paid. And you'll know that by knowing, of course, they're worth all the money they charge for whatever it is they do. Find people you can trust who want real answers to questions so that you can share the premise of getting the truth. If we can share that premise together, friendship by friendship, argument by argument, public YouTube fight versus public YouTube fight, we not only will help our daily lives be more what we want them to be, we'll not only begin to change everything that's wrong in our local societies, we will begin to heal science and return it to its true potential, which is to unify a species around its shared confession of ignorance and its joyous shared pursuit of its resolution in the healing that is knowledge. True knowledge heals the body, the mind, and the soul. That's what the ancient philosophers thought. I am completely unoriginal. I'm just representing what they do. They are my ancestors. I thank you so much for joining me on this journey, especially this wild, topically last public lecture in this course. And I hope that if you're interested, you'll find me in some other way and be able to just stay tuned to this channel for more free content. Thank you very much.